ex-Russian spy, someone who had left the service and gone to England for an asylum. And he was killed in 2006 with high-dose exposure to polonium-210. He died within 3 weeks of exposure. Apparently KGB officers came to Great Britain to find him and laced his cafe or something like that with a small dose of polonium, but it was a big enough dose to kill him. So he ingested it, and partially he must have inhaled it as well. And he died very quickly of radiation sickness. This is not going to happen to those of you who have natural gas with radon in it in your kitchens. I promise you, it's not going to happen in 3 weeks. That's not going to happen. This was just for a little drama. So the clinical effect, I think I have to apologize, this picture was moved over a little too much. The clinical effects are completely dependent upon dose and duration of exposure. So here in this picture, we learn that the most common route of exposure is into the lungs via inhalation for radon and its progeny. This slide is basically a good slide, but it's a bit fuzzy. And so the little cloud around the nose and mouth of this lady, it says air with polonium-210. So she's not like Alexandra Litvinenko. She's just a normal person like us, and she's breathing normal radon breakdown products, decay products, or progeny that are in the air, and they are going straight down into her lungs. And on the right side, oops, oh, sorry about this. On the right side, I must, I'm not using this very well. You can see that the radon or the polonium actually causes DNA damage. That's how it works. That's how it starts a cancer growing. This gentleman, or this schematic diagram of a gentleman, shows the anatomy of someone who unfortunately ingested more than his fair share of radon and its progeny. And it moved down the trachea. And you can see that there's some normal little lymph nodes along the trachea. And it moved into his left lung. His bronchus is here, and these are bronchioles. This is his right lung, and it doesn't look like it's affected. So what happened was, up here in his upper right lobe, he started developing a tumor. The tumor led to an effect upon the local lymph nodes in this region. They became involved with cancerous tissue, which leads to a very, very high likelihood of metastasis. And that's one of the reasons that this cancer, lung cancer, is such a huge health threat to people, because by the time lung cancer is identified, many of the people have already developed metastatic disease, often to the brain, to the bones, and 50% of people with lung cancer, at the time of their diagnosis, 50% of people will die within half a year. So this is a very significant disease, and this also just shows you down here, this little pocket of fluid, very commonly seen in lung cancer. It makes difficult breathing the more that it collects. This is a small pocket, but it gets larger and larger and makes breathing very difficult. So now I'm going to tell you something else. Radon has been connected with lung cancer. It's the #1 cause in non-smokers, and it's the #2 cause of lung cancer in smokers. And it also has a synergistic effect in people who have been secondary smokers, not really smoking themselves, but being exposed. So basically it is the leading cause of lung cancer deaths per year. Approximately 90% of all lung cancer deaths are due to cigarette smoking. And so we see like about 162, 167,000 deaths every year from lung cancer. Now, radon and its progeny, like polonium, are the second leading cause of lung cancer deaths per year. And so about 10% of lung cancer deaths are due to radon and its progeny. And that amounts to 15,000 to 22,000 deaths estimated by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Radon is the leading cause of lung cancer deaths among non-smokers, and these statistics, by the way, are for the United States. This is not global. So about 2,300 people die every year among non-smokers due to radon exposure. They don't die as quickly as cigarette smokers who get lung cancer, which also takes, a long latency period. Radon has a very long latency period as well. Latency period just means the period of development from the time of exposure to a noxious agent until the time the person becomes symptomatically ill and his quality of life begins to deteriorate. Now, if someone is exposed to radon in his home, and we all are, and he's also a cigarette smoker, the risk is at least 10 times higher for cancer. Some people have estimated 20%, but I was unable to validate that, so I'm going with the lower figure. And as I mentioned before, secondary smokers are also a problem. Now, why, you might ask, why is there this synergistic effect between radon exposure and smoking a cigarette? Well, here's the story. Tobacco, again, sorry about that. Tobacco, when it is grown, is introduced to substances in the soil and also in fertilizers. The roots pick up the radon and the polonium, the breakdown products of radon as well, and they draw that up into the leaves, and it remains in the leaves. When cigarettes are processed, cigarettes contain polonium. So when you smoke a cigarette, or when someone you know smokes a cigarette, they are not only exposed to at least 57 known carcinogenic chemicals, like arsenic and benzene and nicotine-specific N-nitrosamines, which are very potent carcinogens, but they're also exposed to radioactivity. These alpha emitters, and they're inhaling it. They're taking big, deep inhalations of polonium right into their lungs, along with all these other pulmonary irritants and dangers. So lung cancer is the main threat from exposure to radon and its progeny. It is the most common cancer in men and women, beating out breast cancer in women, and prostate cancer in men, and colorectal cancer in both. The bad news is approximately 50% of patients die within 1 year after diagnosis. I mentioned that before, and it's basically related to early metastatic disease. And the 5-year survival rate is dismal. It is the lowest among all cancers. There's only a 16% 5-year survival rate. And I just want to make I want to be honest about this and tell you that there are different forms of cancers, and some are more aggressive than others. So not everyone with cancer will have a 16% 5-year survival rate. It all depends on what kind of cancer you have. Small cell cancer, so it does vary. There are many variables, but these are just standardized figures. So here's a really brief course on what carcinogenesis is, at least as it is related to radiation exposure. Carcinogenesis is how cancers develop. It's the study of how cancers develop. And we're going to talk today about alpha particles causing DNA damage, alpha particles from the decay process of radon and its progeny. Obviously, carcinogenesis can occur from many other irritants and carcinogenic agents. So this is just a small section of what carcinogenesis could be. In the case of alpha particles, as we mentioned before, they're highly, highly radioactive. And they can cause DNA damage in the lungs. Again, they can't go through the skin, but if you inhale them, they go straight down to your lung. Your lung tissue doesn't have nice protective tissue on it like skin does, and it will affect the mucous membrane of those tissues. Now, we are lucky enough to have DNA repair mechanisms, but they don't always work. So one of the DNA repair mechanisms is a snipper, to snip it out. And if they can't do that, however, mutations can occur. Proliferation of mutated cells leads to tumor growth. I want to make it clear that no single mutation ever leads to tumor development. There are many other factors or cofactors that participate in carcinogenesis. And it may be the genetic background of the patient, it may be epigenetics, which basically decides which genes are going to be turned on or off, tumor suppressor genes, etc. Individual resiliency, and also getting other mutations along the way that add. Long latency periods characterize cancer development, and they are, again, what goes on between the exposure and the actual symptoms of tumor development. Now, I just want to put this up here quickly to show you that another route of exposure, although a little less common, still very important, is ingestion of radon and its progeny. And when it gets ingested, it can subsequently enter the bloodstream, and alpha particles then can get into the liver and the kidney, and they can cause some damage. I'd like to talk about vulnerable populations now. Children are the most vulnerable population. They have a greater exposure to inhalational agents because they have a much faster respiratory rate per kilogram of body weight than adults do. They may not yet have well enough developed immune systems. They are closer to the floor. And as I mentioned before, polonium can adhere to dust particles, which makes it heavier, so it falls down and is in the air close to the floor and on the floor, which is where children are breathing. They also have many more years of future life ahead of them, within which a cancer can have a long latency period to develop. And little children really don't know how to get out of harm's way yet. Other vulnerable groups are people with pre-existing pulmonary diseases like asthma, pulmonary fibrosis, COPD, people with other chemical exposures, and you see that there's a yellow star here. This is because I want you to know that today, in today's world, everyone has a body burden of toxic chemicals which have accumulated in their bodies over their entire lives, including their in utero period. Elderly people have more than younger period, which may be related to why they have more chronic diseases. And men generally have more than women because men can never unload their body burden of dangerous chemicals, while women, remarkably and sadly, tragically, can unload a portion of their body burden if they're pregnant into their fetus, and also if they're breastfeeding through breast milk. Elderly people also have more fragile immune systems and a high likelihood of existing chronic diseases, so that makes them more vulnerable. They have generally weakened health. The EPA has estimated that for deaths due to radon, there's at least 21. Actually, it's between 15,000 to 22,000. The thing is, we don't hear about this as usual as other things in the newspapers. You hear about accidents and deaths from drunk driving all the time, falls in the home, drownings, home fires, but all of them have a less of a mortality rate. I'd like to just put in a couple of words about social responsibility. We all, that means us doctors, the legal profession, elected officials, we all have the need to protect the quality of life for all New Yorkers, to minimize exposure to known public health threats, such as radon and its progeny, and other chemicals and various health threats too. We have a responsibility to increase public health education and awareness, and we have a responsibility to talk to our elected officials and seek their support. So in summary, I'd like to say that increasing delivery of natural gas to New York State homeowners is a serious public health concern because it will increase background levels of indoor radon and its progeny. It'll increase exposure of New York State residents to radon. It'll increase the incidence of lung cancer among New York State residents and subject specific vulnerable populations to increased cancer risk later in life, including children, and for elderly people and the others that we mentioned before. I just have 3 slides on what you can do to check your house out. I bought this radon gas test kit at Home Depot for $9.99, and you can also get one from the New York State Department of Health for $8.99, so there's not that much of a big thing there. It's very easy to use. You get 2 of these white bottles in this case. You leave them open following the directions in the package in a particular part of your house for 4 days or so, and then you seal them up and you send it off to a laboratory which tests it for radon. There should be no more than 4 picocuries per liter of radon in your house. If you have more than 4, they'll have you repeat the test, but eventually they'll recommend mitigation techniques. Here's the New York State Department of Health, the Bureau of Environmental Radiation. I put this down here so that you can have contact information for them, and we can get this to you later if you don't want to write it down now. And my last slide is on radon mitigation. I mentioned the EPA standard should be below 4 picocuries per liter. They recommend mechanical ventilation systems, and they recommend different approaches to use based on problems you may have with cracked basement floors and walls, or if you have a crawl space, or if your house is built as a slab on grade. So that's my last slide, and I thank you very much for your